This question has intrigued many inquisitive people. Some claim that the national debt has to be repaid eventually. But is it true? What are the consequences of ever expanding the national debt? You have come to the right place for answers. I will guide you through the progression of the problem up to the crescendo. First, a short recap. Whenever the government spends more money than it collects in a given year, it runs a budget deficit. National debt is just the accumulation of all previous unpaid deficits. The government borrows money in the form of bonds of various maturities. Importantly, the majority of bonds are typically held by domestic institutions and a minority by foreigners. So does the government have to repay the debt? Well, in a sense, yes. The bonds are a contract binding the issuer to repay the principal plus interest to the bondholder. So the governments have to pay, otherwise they are in default. More on that later. However, there is nothing stopping the governments from paying the old debt by issuing new bonds, a practice called rolling the debt. So the national debt does not have to be repaid down to zero, ever. That doesn't mean, though, that the debt can be accumulated indefinitely without any side effects. So now, I will lead you through the progression of the problems with national debt. Firstly, the government has to pay interest on the debt. Obviously, the more you owe, the higher the interest payments. In USA, for example, the annual interest payments of the federal government have skyrocketed to almost $1.1 trillion this year. That's more than the entire US defense budget and almost as much as the public education budget. This money is wasted every year now. Well, when I say wasted, it's not entirely fair. It goes to the bondholders. Therefore, it is important what percentage of the national debt is held domestically. The higher, the better. Japan has the largest national debt in the world, but virtually all of it is held domestically, so the interest payments get reinvested into the economy. Still, the majority of the benefits accrue to the financial sector, so it's not like an ordinary Joe gets much out of it. At this point, I should mention that the absolute amount of debt is not as important as the amount relative to the size of the economy. This relative size is measured as the debt to GDP ratio. If the debt in any given year increases by 1%, but the GDP grows by 4%, the debt to GDP ratio actually decreases, which is what really matters. So going forward, when I talk about debt accumulation, I mean increase of the debt to GDP ratio. The second problem with debt accumulation is that once the debt to GDP crosses a certain threshold, the government bonds may get punished by credit rating agencies with worse credit rating. The credit rating is an indicator of riskiness of the asset. So the worsening of the rating is typically followed by the necessity to increase the interest rate of newly issued bonds in order to be able to sell them. The degradation from the best AAA rating to AA may not be as significant, but the lower you are, the worse it gets. So not only does the accumulation of more debt mean that you have to pay interest on an ever-increasing amount of money, but the interest rate itself gets higher at some point. Where is this point? There is no single threshold. It is highly individual and depends on many variables. Generally, the larger and more advanced the economy, the more resilient it is. USA being the #1 global economy is the only reason why it still has the best or second best rating, despite having debt to GDP of more than 120%. Another variable is the rate of change of the indebtedness. The rating agencies may view more favorably a country with high debt but currently balanced budget than somewhat lower debt with huge budget deficits. Going one level deeper, it is also important what is the reason for the budget deficits. One-time unexpected outlays, such as helping the victims of natural disaster or stimulus payments during a pandemic, are less problematic, since it is expected that they will disappear and the finances will be rebalanced again. But structural imbalances, that is, spending more money than collecting on a regular basis, is much more problematic. In such case, unless there is explosive economic growth, the only remedy is unpopular change in legislation, whether cutting spending or increasing taxes and tariffs. So downgrade of the credit rating can set the country on a path of no return, as Greece has learned the hard way. Before we explore the path of no return, I have to answer why there haven't been many economic collapses so far, despite the decades of growing debts. We are at the end of a very long period of globally declining interest rates, which hit rock bottom during the pandemic. The US national debt grew almost 2.5 times in terms of debt to GDP since the beginning of the century. Over the same period, though, the interest rate on the national debt dropped 3 times, so the interest payments relative to GDP were lower in 2020 than in the year 2000. This trend is now over. The global inflationary wave forced the central banks to increase their signal interest rates, and the government bonds had to follow suit. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the rates will remain elevated for many years to come, so doubling the debt again will no longer be enabled by plummeting interest rates. I have to ask you for a favor. I put a lot of effort into these videos. If you feel that I deserve it, please consider subscribing to this channel and hit the like button. Further debt accumulation can set the economy on a path of no return, which I will define as a vicious debt spiral from which it is almost impossible to escape through traditional fiscal means, and quite inevitably leads to one of 2 bad outcomes. The spiral looks like this. In the absence of decreasing interest rates, which as I said was the case for the last few decades, accumulating more debt leads to higher interest payments. In the absence of tax hikes or spending cuts, higher interest payments lead to higher budget deficits, which in turn accelerate the growth of the debt. This could be manageable if economic growth was faster than the growth of the deficits, but as I said earlier, I am talking about growing debt to GDP ratio, which automatically means that the growth of the debt is faster than the GDP growth. On top of that, if the growing debt and deficits lead to downgrade of credit rating and a consequent increase of interest rates, this only exacerbates the entire problem. The tax hikes or spending cuts necessary to get the situation under control become increasingly stringent and thus politically ever more untenable. What makes this downward spiral increasingly impossible to escape is the fact that even if such spending cuts or tax hikes were eventually enacted, they would inevitably slow down the economic growth by throttling consumption. That would bring about less tax collection and higher welfare spending, so part of those savings would be cancelled by these negative side effects. Greece got into this spiral around 2010. Eventually, it blew past 150% debt to GDP, and the interest rate on the new bonds was rising too. By 2011, the interest payments on the national debt represented almost 8% of the Greek GDP and 1/5 of the government spending. Theoretically, Greece could have started on a journey of extreme austerity, as was demanded by the leadership of the European Union. Practically though, by the time that any country gets so deep into the problem, the austerity would have to be both extreme and long-lasting, which is politically unfeasible. At that point, as I alluded to, one of 2 outcomes become unavoidable. Which one of those 2 depends mainly on whether the country is in control of the currency in which the majority of the debt is denominated. Let's start with the best-case scenario, in which the economy has 100% of the national debt denominated in its domestic currency, over which it has full control. That is basically the case of USA. Almost 100% of the US national debt is denominated in dollars, and the control over US dollars lies in the hands of the Fed. In that case, the central bank can purchase the government bonds, either directly or indirectly, with new money created out of thin air, which is basically what quantitative easing is all about. Note that this is not guaranteed. The central banks are independent of the government in most developed economies, so the board has to be complicit and willing to monetize the debt. However, since the global financial crisis, the central banks seem to be more than willing to do this. The monetization itself helps somewhat, because it artificially increases demand for the bonds and thus allows the government to keep interest rates slightly lower than otherwise. Also, if there is always the central bank that can step in, the government doesn't have to fear the possibility that the bonds would not be sold and the government would go bankrupt. Nevertheless, the monetization itself doesn't help with the problem of growing debt and deficits. It is the side effect of monetization: inflation. Inflation of the currency erodes everything denominated in that currency: incomes, savings, asset values, and yes, the national debt and deficits. Monetization of the debt reliably causes inflation down the road. Debunking claims to the contrary deserves a video by itself. Biden's presidency is a perfect example of this principle. Despite record-high deficits, the debt to GDP remained constant, since the nominal GDP has ballooned due to the inflation. As Milton Friedman liked to say, inflation is a taxation without legislation. It wipes out a portion of savings and erodes the purchasing power of incomes. As such, it is a blanket austerity measure, responsibility for which is easier to dump than for a tax hike or spending cut. It should also warn you. The cumulative inflation since 2021 in USA was 20%, and still the debt to GDP only remained the same, not decreased. And with rising interest rates, the problem is worse than ever. Without significant fiscal restraint, much more debt would have to be inflated away to make the situation more sustainable. So here is a gloomy prediction for the USA. If Americans want to avoid another period of very high inflation, here is what needs to happen with the debt crisis. For starters, the debt to GDP ratio needs to stop growing. To achieve this, the budget deficit needs to be smaller than the combination of real GDP growth and inflation. Long-term average economic growth in the USA in the last 20 years was some 2% per year, and projections of future growth also converge around that number. If inflation were to stay on an average level of 2% per year, then with GDP growth it would combine to some 4% per year. So the budget deficit should be at most 4% of GDP, just to prevent the debt crisis from getting even worse. At current GDP, that means some $1.1 trillion. Last year, it was 1.7 trillion or 6.3% of GDP, and the projection for this year is 1.9 trillion and 7% of GDP. So that is already some $800 billion that need to be cut every year. And even that would be enough only if the interest rate on the debt remained constant. Ignoring the debt crisis will not only mean that ever-increasing share of the tax dollar will go to waste, but periods of high inflation will almost certainly recur. For those states that cannot monetize their national debt, there is the real crescendo: debt default. The inability to monetize can generally happen in two scenarios. First is that the country is not in control of its own domestic currency. This was the case of Greece. It uses euro, over which it has no direct control, since it is directed by European Central Bank. In the second scenario, the country has control over its own currency, but majority of its debt is taken in foreign currency, such as in Argentina. Despite using its own Argentinian peso, some 2/3 of its debt was in foreign currency, mainly the dollar, around the time of its last default in 2020. So what is the default and what are its consequences? Debt default is the inability of the government to pay its obligations, no matter whether it is just the interest or repayment of the bond at the end of its maturity. So what if the country just erased all the debt? What if the government said, we are simply not gonna pay those bonds? There would be several negative consequences. First, the country would be unable to raise new debt because no creditors would believe the country anymore. Certain financial gamblers might provide some money, but only at very high interest rates. This would necessitate a balanced budget, which such countries typically do not have, because that's how they got here in the first place. So tax hikes or spending cuts would be required anyway. Second, it would significantly hurt the wealth of the population. The portfolios of pension funds and other investment funds typically contain a large share of domestic bonds. Imagine approaching the retirement age and finding out that 1/3 of your lifetime savings have just been wiped out. Impoverishing your population usually necessitates more welfare spending down the road, which is really bad luck if you need to keep a balanced budget. Third consequence: a meltdown of the banking sector would be almost inevitable. Banks also typically hold significant amounts of domestic bonds. In the case of default, the banks would take a huge hit to their balance sheet, which would endanger their solvency. Many banks are also dependent on short-term loans from other banks, but in the aftermath of a default, foreign financial institutions would be skeptical to lend money to banks in that country. Also, as we will explore in the next point, demand for new loans would decrease and more bank clients would default on their debt, which could trigger liquidity crisis. If the banks somehow survived all of this, which is unlikely, the general mistrust in the population might lead to bank runs, which would definitely be the last nail in the coffin. Meltdown of the banking sector could result in people losing much of their money in their accounts, as well as a credit crunch, that is, the banks would not provide new loans. This would be especially bad for businesses, since most of them rely on bank loans to continue their operation. This leads us directly to the fourth consequence, a long economic crisis. I just told you one reason. In the absence of credit, many businesses would fail, and the credit crunch would generally throttle demand. Another one is that people would become more thrifty after losing part of their savings, thus again decreasing demand in the short to medium term. Foreign investors as well as domestic ones would likely flee with their capital elsewhere, thus decreasing investments in the economy. Lastly, as I said, the government would probably need to run a balanced budget. If the economy was used to artificially prop up its growth through deficit spending, the austerity measures would again decrease demand. Fifth consequence, the default would likely lead to significant devaluation of the country's currency, which would make imports much more expensive and thus trigger inflation. Argentina, following its 2020 default, is a case in point. Last consequence, if the default was one-sided decision rather than negotiated internationally, it would worsen the diplomatic relations with countries whose creditors were affected. Governments of those foreign countries might retaliate in some way. So no, there is no running away from the debt. There is no pain-free way to deal with it, but the pain might be small if dealt with early. If you're old enough, you may not live to see the consequences, but your children and grandchildren will. So I urge you as voters, demand more fiscal responsibility from your politicians. Thank you for your attention.